Welcome to Headliners of Service, our virtual speakers series presented by the Global Service Institute at Long Island University, featuring engaging conversations with exceptional leaders from all walks of life. These inspiring, timely, and fascinating discussions are hosted by Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby, the chair of the Global Service Institute. Today's headliner is Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of America's 34th president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a renowned international security expert. She's also the author of a newly released book, How Ike Led, the Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions. During this presentation, we invite all of you to ask questions in the Q&A box, and we will have our guest answer as many as possible later in the program. You can also email them right now to questions@globalserviceinstitute.org. Everyone, please welcome Rita Cosby.
And hello, everybody. I am Rita Cosby, and welcome to our inaugural Headliners of Service Speaker Series hosted by the Global Service Institute at LIU. And we are launching in grand fashion with the extraordinary Susan Eisenhower, who I have known for years. I'm honored to call friend, and who is really an exceptional individual. Susan, great to have you with us.
Oh, Rita, thanks so much for this wonderful opportunity. And it's great news that this Global Service Institute is on its way, because it's a tremendously important undertaking.
Thank you so much. And you know, Susan, it's so perfect to start with you, because the Institute is about service, it's about leadership. And I think those are two pivotal qualities that I really think epitomize your grandfather.
Well, he certainly did serve his country for more than 50 years, starting at West Point, extending all the way through World War II, and then to a two-term presidency that ended in 1961. So it's a remarkable record and a lot of history there.
It sure is. And you know what I love about your book, and everybody, it is called How Ike Led. It's an homage not just to an extraordinary president, but to also an extraordinary grandfather. And it really is also a love letter to your grandfather, but also gives us a bird's eye view to history. And I have thought so much, Susan, especially of the coming months, of what we've been dealing with of late, and also what's ahead when we've been dealing with the pandemic and a difficult economy. And I think we can all gain strength from the courage that your grandfather had and the difficult decisions he made. It's so timely, and I think it puts life and this moment in history so much in perspective, don't you think?
Well, I do. I think it's a very timely book. And the way I sort of sum it up is I say that Ike still has a lot to say to us. One of the things that I think that it's most important that he says to us is that we can do this. He was a man of abiding optimism, largely because he believed that if you frame things in negative, pessimistic terms, that inspires no one to move forward or to find some kind of agreement about what needs to go next. People end up giving up. And I think he would be certainly out there leading the charge to be well organized, to progress with the science of what's capable of bringing an end to, or at least a management of the COVID situation, and also to unite the country.
Yeah, and that message of unity is really, I think, what epitomizes your incredible grandfather's life. You know, I'm a deep fan of what he has accomplished and his legacy. I mean, I think he was truly one of the greatest presidents we ever had, one of the greatest war heroes we've ever had too as well. But you know what's amazing, and I think you carried this out so beautifully, he never got cynical, and he kept humility through all of that. Those are two amazing traits, Susan, you know that.
Well, I think that was the thing that I found absolutely extraordinary. I knew him very well before he, in my youth. He died when I was almost 18 years old, and I had a real opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. Then, as I entered my career, I started out as a journalist, and then later in strategic communications. Then finally, I ended up in the policy world, where communications and journalism all comes together in any case, I started really diving into his career, and then I tried to, at some stage, develop the courage to put what I knew about him together with what I was reading. And I think that's the thing that's really stunning. When you think of what he'd seen, the brutality and the outrageous behavior of the Nazis during World War II. I mean, outrageous doesn't even begin to be an adequate word for that. The sort of things he had to order, I mean, people into very, very difficult military operations. And yet for all of that, for all of the soaring spirit of humanity and all of the evil and unthinkable things that human beings are capable of, somehow throughout his life, he managed to reconcile this somewhere inside himself and never displayed at any time I ever saw any cynicism or hardness. He did not become a hard person. And I think that's really extraordinary.
Yeah, that's an exceptional quality. And obviously what made him such a great leader too, because he passed those values down. I thought it was interesting too, Susan, that he shared that too with people on his team. He wanted them to be self-sufficient and responsible, but yet they also had to be accountable. He sort of had those two qualities, right?
Well, that's right. But accountability, expecting accountability of your subordinates never works unless the big guy accepts accountability too. And Eisenhower that was really fundamental to who he was. He believed in a higher cause. In this case, it was the cause of the United States of America. And he was a trained military officer. And like the finest of that group, he understood that accountability is central, not only to leadership, but also in keeping the trust of your subordinates, who are absolutely critical for any operation as well. There's some wonderful stories during World War II of Ike accepting full and complete responsibility for everything, by the way, including the weather forecast.
Yeah,
and
down to that detail.
I know. Well, the reason the forecast was part of his responsibility was that he made the decision to go against the predictions of his meteorology team. And so, that was rightly so. And as a matter of fact, on June 5th, just before he launched the assault on the Normandy coast as the beginning of the final push for liberation of Europe, he wrote a note that he kept in his wallet that would be used if the operation failed. And in it, he said, of course, that the troops had done everything devotion to duty could do. If there's any blame that attaches to this, it is mine and mine alone. He understood that if he failed, he would rightly have to step back and take the responsibility for it. And I think that's rather inspiring in today's environment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that note, of course, such a famous note. We're going to talk a lot about Normandy in a little bit, because that is so pivotal, of course, I think, of who he is and the decisions that he made. And as you point out, that the success, he would share the success, but if there was failure, he was willing to accept it. And that's an extraordinary ability, I think, of leadership. I want to talk about some of the early days, as you point out, because I'm so jealous that you had the chance to spend so much time with this extraordinary, exceptional figure that is, again, I think, going to go down as one of the greatest presidents in history, Susan, your beloved grandfather. You, as a young child, you'd go to the White House. I've been to the White House a number of times, but I was always a guest. I wasn't a relative going to the White House. Did you realize when you were a young child that this is the people's house? This is something exceptional, or was it grandfather's house?
Oh, I think my grandparents made it pretty clear that they were there through the grace and favor of the American public, and that it was the public's house, and that they were residents there during Eisenhower's term of office. But we were schooled very, very carefully never to take advantage of the American taxpayer, for instance. My grandmother, of course, had great instincts about interior design, and she designed a number of lovely homes for well, she had to learn how to extemporize after all when he was in the Army and they went to all these far-flung Army posts. But when she finally, decorated the first home they ever owned in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, she did a lovely job with it. And she wanted so much to do it, at least a couple of rooms at the White House. But my grandfather said, absolutely no. We are going to balance this federal budget, and we're not going to be asking the American people to pay for newly decorated rooms at the White House. So that's kind of the way we were living in that environment.
You know, one of my favorite stories also in your book, you talk about how your grandmother loved his bald head, his very famous bald head, and what she would pat his head while he was asleep at night.
Well, she would occasionally, yeah, and they had an absolutely charming relationship, really. He was the third of 7 sons, one of whom died in infancy, but still, okay, one of 6 sons, and she was one of 4 girls. And she was quintessentially feminine in every possible way, and he was alpha male. And the two of them were hysterical together. I don't get into that too much in this book because 25 years ago, believe it or not, it's been that long, wow, I wrote a book called Mrs. Ike, Memories and Reflections on the Life of Mamie Eisenhower. And
I have read that book too, my friend.
Oh my gosh,
it's fabulous.
La, la.
Yes.
Well, the purpose of that book was really to tell the story of their relationship and their marriage and what it was, what kind of a contribution, unique contribution she made as a first lady. In How Ike Led, what I think it's essentially a leadership book, but I tried to do what all good journalists do, and you know this way better than I do, which is to show how he led rather than tell how he led. There's no 10-point plan in this book for leading like Dwight Eisenhower. Therefore, it's a kind of intermixed story of the history of the period, plus some biography, but really focusing on a number of key decisions he made to show, actually, and I thought this was important, to show that Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander of forces in Europe during World War II, and Dwight Eisenhower, the president, was the same person. And so many of the biographies are either about the presidency or they're about the war, that you don't sort of see an integrated whole as easily. So that was my objective, because the way he thought was deeply informed by his role during World War I and World War II. And he brings all that with him to the White House.
And by the way, I think you shared that message that you just wanted to relay in the book so beautifully. And you also give us a human perspective to so much about the man and such great firsthand experiences. And I want to talk a little bit about some of these just wonderful moments that you also share in the book, How Ike Led. Susan, you talk about also, so you had the commonality of horses. You and your grandfather shared a love of horses. And there's a story about a putting green. And I want to have you share that. I love that story.
Well, you see, first of all, back to accountability. Okay, well.
You learned it at an early age.
I did. And I want to say the other thing that I made note of, and by the way, I should just say thank you for saying that this is a love letter to Dwight Eisenhower, but actually he's not always right. He's not always right in this book either, by his own evaluation. And so I think that's the thing that was remarkable about him, is that he did learn from his mistakes. And okay, so now this brings me to the putting green. Speaking of mistakes with the capital
I was going to say that's a good segue.
This is a good segue, exactly. I took up horseback riding. Well, I should start by saying my grandfather made sure I had golf lessons, and I thought I was doing pretty well until the golf pro thought that my swing needed some changes, and suddenly I got discouraged because it was going to take a lot of practice. And I went out once with Granddad on the golf on the green, and I held everything up. He was very nice about it, but I held everybody up so much that I thought I've got to find something else. So I took up horseback riding. And it turns out that this was in the latter part of his presidency. But one evening, he and my grandmother liked to sit out on a sun porch, and off in the distance, you could see, if there were no trees, you could see Big and Little Round Top at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But
Yeah. Wow.
actually, there was a forest of trees in between these two sites and a large American flagpole. And at a certain hour every evening, they would sit on the porch and watch the flags being brought down, the American flag and his 5-star generalship flag. And that evening, getting ready to go in for dinner, I was daydreaming or doing something I shouldn't have been doing. And 5 of these horses pushed against the paddock gate, and out they ran. And they just didn't run a little. They didn't stay close to the barn. They're running all around the property, going right over my grandparents' lawn where they're sitting out waiting for a dinner to be called. And then they swooped around and ran right over Granddad's putting green. Now, he had that green installed because if you went out to a public course, crowds would gather and you'd have to sign autographs, and he didn't mind doing that at all. But honestly, any man who is, relentlessly in public life deserves to have some private moments. So that's what that putting green was for, and I knew that perfectly well. And then for the next hour or so, we had everybody out there, including the Secret Service. We had farm hands, and I'm out there. We're replacing the divots on the golf green. And so then I had to finally got the horses settled, and I had to go into the house and face the music. And not only did the horses run over the golf green, but I was late for dinner. Oh my God. We're a punctual family. So I walked in a state of terror. I think I held it in pretty well, but I was sure I was going to, be punished in some way or
Right.
whatever. And he used to sit in a swivel chair, and he swiveled around and he said, "Wow, you know what I said to your grandmother? I haven't seen horses run like that since I was a kid in Abilene, Kansas." And he
Wow.
welcomed me in. And then I said, I'm so terribly sorry. It's my fault. I was daydreaming and I should have been paying attention. Now, remember, this is the same man who wrote a note for his to be released in case of failure, that he took full blame if the D-Day invasion did not succeed. So I'm sure I helped myself a lot by accepting full and complete responsibility for the mess. But he was so gracious about it, and he never raised it with me again. Regrettably, the following year, the golf green had to be taken out because golf greens are very sensitive, as you probably know, and it just they couldn't repair what the horses had damaged. They caught a little virus or whatever happens to lawns. So that was a sad experience of me actually depriving a person who deserved privacy, that I had deprived him of that opportunity. But the fact
what's amazing though is that lesson though, Susan, that you just
Yeah.
said, that he because you took accountability. Do you think it would have gone a different way had you not?
I think if I came in acting like it was somebody else's fault, I would have caught hell, because he did not like that at all. And he expected everybody around him to be accountable, because that's how you don't make mistakes. West Point, they advance an idea which I think is brilliant, and I try and use it myself because it's very simple. Plebes, who are also known as freshmen,
Right.
Go to West Point, and in order to train these young military officers to take full responsibility, they're only allowed, or to follow orders, they're only allowed to answer upperclassmen with 4 answers to specific questions. Yes, sir. No, sir. No excuses, sir. Or I don't have the information. I'll get that for you, sir. So Eisenhower lived his whole life with a no excuses mentality. And what it does is it trains you to think in advance about how to avoid making mistakes. So this is at the heart of great contingency planning. I'm an obsessive contingency planner, probably due to allowing 5 horses to go over a golf green, but it's still very useful, I think, that whole idea. If there are no excuses for what you do, then what do you have to do to avert something that might make you wish that you could come up with an excuse.
Absolutely, and also a clear plan.
Clear
One of
plan.
the other things that I want to stay on the horse topic, because I love this other story too. One of your most prized possessions is a trophy. And can you tell us just, briefly that story? Because he also appreciated when something meant something to somebody else. I
Yeah, well,
love it.
that's
It
true.
was what, a trot and walk trophy, am I right?
Yeah, walk. Yeah. Well, so first of all, what you have to know about Dwight Eisenhower is he loved kids. He absolutely loved kids. And in my research, I came across so many completely fascinating little stories about correspondence he had with little kids. And he was always trying to give them encouragement. But during the war, my biggest shock was that, uh, this five-star general carried around a little purse of lucky coins. And the lucky coins were sent to him by members of the American public. And there was one lucky coin that he was most attached to. And that was a little lucky coin sent to him by a 9-year-old girl who lived in Detroit, Michigan. This is very cute. So you have to, with that as a backdrop, you have to know that he's fascinated by kids, and he loved things that they knew that he needed to learn. So we started learning new math when we were kids, and I couldn't even figure it out, and I'm not sure he could either, but he didn't want to be left behind in this process. So he gave me a lot of encouragement in writing, and he was a very fine horseman. The Army of his time, back during World War I, we even had a cavalry division, so they all had to learn how to ride. And Ike was very attached to horses. So after I failed with my golf swing, that was my decision. I became this horseback rider, and I won a walk trot competition. And literally the cup was about that round and about that big. I mean, literally you could probably put, 5 almonds in it and feel like you've presented it perfectly well for a cocktail party. Well, the thing was that he was so proud of me for this walk trot competition that I don't know, the thing disappeared. I didn't probably notice it, but about 2 weeks after this competition, he presents it to me, and he had it mounted on a pedestal. It really looked like a very, very important award, but it was really just a very sweet form of encouragement. And he used to write me a lot of letters too about riding and about horses' personalities and how to manage certain things with them and not to give up on them because they can be very finicky.
And he was a man of many talents too. He was a painter, and I think about some of his paintings, Susan. You used to stand behind him also, behind the easel, and watch him while he was doing this. And he actually did a painting that he gave to Churchill, and did it of a lot of amazing people. But yet there was a great line that I saw where he said, and still humble, typical of your grandfather, said, I guess when it was an exhibit of his paintings, he said, that they wouldn't put me in here if I weren't president, that I'm not that good, basically.
Oh, it's really true because, first of all, he would paint. And for reasons of I'm not going to call it stress relief, but he used painting as a way to center himself. And when he had very, very complicated issues, it would require such focus, even for short periods of time, that then it would allow his mind to be working on the other levels that often happen when people are thinking through complex issues. You can't be zeroed in on the complex issue all the time, or your brain doesn't have an opportunity to allow other creative solutions to come to mind. And so, yes, I used to stand behind him, but he, oh my gosh, the number he actually kept and the number he asked his valet to dispose of, he threw away many more than he kept. And a lot of those reemerged after his death because his valet hated the thought of throwing any of them out. That's why you see a little uneven quality out there, if you go on Google. But I think the thing that's really moving about it, he had no pretensions about painting the way Winston Churchill did, for instance. Winston Churchill wanted to be regarded as almost a professional artist, and Eisenhower didn't care what anybody thought particularly, because he was doing it, as part of a method for centering himself. In any case, yes, it turns out that the most placid of his paintings tended to take place in the middle of great crises. And I do own one of those paintings that is painted in 1957, but it's given to me in 1958, which means that it spans the time from the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in September of 57 through the launch of Sputnik in October of 1957. So he must have been painting that painting at the time, and it's completely placid. It looks like there's nothing on his mind, but he found that of great use.
Wow, and two obviously very pivotal and difficult times in our
Right.
history, those two moments you think about. You know what I thought was so interesting, and everybody, again, we're talking to Susan Eisenhower, international national security expert, policy expert, also, of course, the granddaughter of our 34th US president, has an amazing book, and I encourage everybody to get it. It is called How Ike Led. And what's incredible too, Susan, and he was obviously such a military man and so disciplined to his core, but I learned so much about him in your book. And as you're sharing with us now, which we're also grateful for, we have so many people watching literally all over the world now. And I think about, Susan, how he went to West Point not to be a soldier, right? He was going there because he was getting a free education. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, it's really a remarkable thing when you think about it, how much talent would have been lost if this hadn't been an opportunity for young aspiring men, and now men and women. Ulysses S. Grant, who was a victorious general during the Civil War, also went to West Point for a free education. And so neither of them had exactly envisioned themselves as a soldier, but once they found out that the United States government would make that opportunity possible, they both went. And I must say that it's rather amusing too that both of them, including John Pershing, who was our commander during World War I, American commander during World War I, all three of them were not graduates at the top of their classes. And I would even say that Eisenhower and Grant, of course, Grant had, I think, was absolutely at the bottom in terms of his disciplinary record. But Eisenhower was somewhere in the middle. And I think what this says about all three of these important commanders is that they were always questioning things. They were always questioning, why are we doing it this way? Or that's silly, or something like that. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't learn how to follow orders. I'm simply saying that at the core of their personalities, that they were the kind of people who would think outside of the box. And at one stage, Rita, it's really quite remarkable. After Eisenhower graduated from West Point, he was almost court-martialed for espousing out-of-the-box ideas about how tanks could be used. At that time, the Army thought of tanks as sort of mobile storage units that would go at the same pace as marching soldiers. And Eisenhower said, well, why couldn't they be armored? And why couldn't they have large guns, and why couldn't they eventually pick up enormous speed and actually play a pivotal role in the execution of any military operation? And he was told, stop writing those articles right now. So, it's fascinating to me that the military at that time just wasn't open to more ideas. But then, probably the older military officers probably didn't want to hear it from somebody 26 years old. I don't know, but it turns out that he and George Patton were the two real tank advocates in the Army, and both of them, of course, played pivotal roles in World War II.
And boy, did they ever. And talk about also the questioning of different ideas and thoughts. What I think is so important, Susan Eisenhower, is we think about in D-Day and Normandy, and I know you have been back to Normandy a number of times. It was my first experience when
Yeah,
actually you and I were there together
I know.
in 2019, the 75th anniversary. And that was so amazing to, to
Yeah.
be there with you, my friend, at such a historic, important moment. And I think about your grandfather getting the advice, and this was what, about a week before D-Day,
Mhm.
he gets advice from one of his advisors saying, don't send the paratroopers in. It's too risky. Because the theory was that the casualty rate could just be too great, that it could have been, what, 50 to 75% casualty rate of our brave, US men going in at that point. Um, but he said, no, we have to send them in. Talk about that pivotal moment, because that was absolutely critical to the success of Normandy, and I think success of freedom in the world.
Well, I think this story. Thank you, Rita, so much for that question, because I think this is really one of the pivotal stories about Eisenhower's wartime leadership. Actually, this advisor had more responsibility for the airborne troops than anybody else, any of Ike's other subordinates. He was, this is Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, um, a British officer who was in charge of the airborne part of the invasion. And he went to Eisenhower, as you say, about a week before D-Day and says, the Germans are moving into um, different positions. We're seeing some activity there. And I recommend against using the airborne troops, because of airborne troops were going to be dropping behind lines um, so that they could clear several causeways and routes off the beaches. And if they didn't capture those causeways, our troops could have been stuck on the beach or thrown back into the water. And so Eisenhower said to Lee Mallory, please put your recommendation in writing, because if I decide against you, I don't want you to be held responsible for my decision. Okay. Then he goes to his trailer. He says, I need 2 hours. And he went to his trailer, and then he did what he would call stripping down the problem. To find the essence of what it was they were trying to accomplish and whether this was pivotal. And he decided, because he had fought so hard for the addition of Utah Beach in the early planning, that this was pivotal, because if we didn't secure those causeways, our boys wouldn't be able to get off the beaches. So he took the risk of a 50 to 70% casualty rate. And then he wrote that note that I described earlier, and then he went out to look those young boys in the eyes. He visited every unit he could get to before they actually deployed for the Normandy coast. And that famous picture of Eisenhower in the 101st Airborne Division is one of those pictures. Now, if you could give me one more minute, I want to tell you that he wasn't saying to them, go get them, we're going to win this war, we're going to do this and this. No, he was actually in that very famous picture where he's got his,
he's smiling, right? Beaming and smiling with them. I remember that.
But he looked very determined. So you don't know whether they're getting a pep talk. No, what he was doing was showing this tall paratrooper, number 23. He was gesturing about fly fishing. And so that's what this looks to be. And he did that frequently. He would talk to people about home when he went out to see these young boys. Now, my grandparents lost a little boy at the age of 3 to scarlet fever. And
Dowd.
Yes, Dowd. And it was the most heartbreaking personal moment of their lives. And so how hard it must have been to go look at these young guys in the faces, talk about home, and understand not only the impact of a life cut short, but the pain it would cause their families for the rest of their lives. And he had the moral courage to do it. And history is so happy to know that we only lost, I shouldn't say only, because every life is that important, but the casualty rate was between 4% on D-Day itself and 10% overall. But you know, he believed in delegation, and he believed that Trafford Lee Mallory had a very important point to raise with him. And so dropping the airborne troops, that decision in the context of a very dubious weather forecast on D-Day makes the decision on the weather forecast even more significant, because airborne troops need reasonable weather in order to drop onto their targeted areas.
You know, it was such a privilege, Susan, too, because you and I got a chance to meet some of those guys who were the paratroopers. And, you know, I call them all sort of like treasures, because they're still heroes living among us, as you and I know. So, and you could see their young eyes and just how proud they were to have been a part of this incredible success that literally, as I say, freed the world. And I think about, too, your grandfather also visited Warsaw, and that's something very deeply personal. As you know, to me, my father was a prisoner of war in World War II. He was a Polish resistance fighter, and then became, you know, he was captured, he escaped, and he was rescued by American troops. And your grandfather, you know, I'm just, for me, it's such an honor to be able to speak with you, because I think of the role your grandfather played, not just for America, but for countries like my father's country, my father's homeland of Poland, and what he did for the world. Is, you know, we can never just thank your grandfather and your family enough for everything that they have done and sacrificed. But there's those famous shots of your grandfather walking in Warsaw and him saying that he has never seen such destruction in a European city. And that was literally, it was basically the blocks that my father was fighting in, Susan. So it's very personal.
Oh, well, I mean, this gives me chills up and down my spine. But if Ike were here, you know, he would be the first to say that your father and everybody else played roles that were every bit as important, if not more so, than the role he was playing. I mean, you know, he really did believe in teamwork. And I think there's a lot of feeling like, oh, we'll have teamwork because that's a good thing to have. No, he understood it completely. I thought the other moving thing I discovered as I did my research is that he would go to other groups after the war and remind them that every job everybody did was absolutely central to the organization's capacity to function. So during the time when he was president of Columbia University after the war and before the presidency, or I should say before he became the first commander of NATO, he called in the maintenance staff to Low Library, and he introduced himself as Ike, invited them all to call him Ike, which is rather sweet.
Don't call me president, don't call me general.
That's right. So, but he said to all of them, you know, I respect, I can't tell you how much I respect the work you do for Columbia University, and I want you to know I regard you as integral to everything we're trying to accomplish here at Columbia University. And one of the maintenance men, you know, just remarked that no president of Columbia had ever invited the maintenance staff in to do anything at Columbia. And that's just, and that wasn't for show. He advanced the same notion during his presidency, you know, that everyone from people doing what we'd call today the essential workers were central to our success. And we're seeing it again today, right? But he believed that everybody played a role and everybody should be treated with respect, due to them because of that. But boy, what would we do, Rita, today without the people who've reported for duty? I mean, literally and figuratively.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And he had such a sense of service and of giving back. You know, there's one other, there's so many extraordinary stories in your book, How Ike Led, Susan. And one of the other ones I think of that's, as you talk about service, and obviously on different levels, but since we're talking military here, I think about there was a pact he actually made with your father when your father went off to Korea, that he also sensed he was so proud that his son was in the military. And yet he also said, at this moment, I am the commander in chief, and you have an additional responsibility if you go there. Like, I cannot be blackmailed. Tell that story. I think it is so pivotal of who he is.
I think civilians might have a hard time understanding this story because we're often pushing our elected officials to make sure that their children serve in combat or something like that. But at least in the Eisenhower ethos of self-sacrifice and duty, that comes with a price. And so that's what happened. My father was deployed with a unit in Korea, but when my grandfather was elected president, or I should say inaugurated president, he and my father had a very serious conversation. My father was very worried that he would be brought home. And I said, well, we're going to have to talk about this. I'm now commander in chief of all the armed forces. And the one thing that cannot happen to me is to have my options foreclosed by some situation that might bring about a blackmail threat or some compromising of the American presidency in the face of this war. So he says, if you can join your unit again, but if you do so, you have to make a commitment to me. I'm just going to paraphrase this for you, that you'll take your own life. In other words, you must carry a handgun with you, you must sleep with one, and you have to promise me that you will never allow yourself to be taken as a hostage or do anything that would compromise the United States of America. So my father said, okay, I agree to the rules, and off he went back to Korea. Now, by this time, I'm born, and I have two older siblings. So, my father told us that story, a number of times over the course of years. And it does seem extraordinary that the President of the United States would exact that agreement, knowing that it would leave his three grandchildren without a father. But that's what he did, and might seem harsh to people, but actually that's what doing your duty certainly meant to those two men anyway.
Yeah, and he always focused on duty and country. We talked a bit, of course, about his message of unity. He was a Republican, but a lot of people didn't know if he was a Democrat or a Republican. He was a moderate. He was somebody who really, and even within his cabinet, he had a number of Democrats, correct? He really saw it as an umbrella, as the role of a presidency was for all people.
Well, this might sound like science fiction today, but we have to think about his background. He came out of the military. We've had very, very few, we've only had three military, commanders at that level who also had a two-term presidency, and that is George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight Eisenhower. And so, that is already singular, but they do bring something very different to the table, and that is a nonpartisanship that comes with being in the military. Many people don't realize that until, moderately recently, I would say probably until the 50s or maybe even into the 60s, the military did not vote in elections. Certainly George Marshall, who was chief of staff of the Army, was very proud of the fact that he had never voted in an election because his job was literally to serve the country. And that was Eisenhower's position too. So you can imagine after the war, nobody knew whether he was a Republican or a Democrat because he had not registered to vote. And so please, everybody register to vote now. Don't take it.
Yes.
But that's the way it was. So he is always imbued with the fact that the cause that he has undertaken with his vow at West Point when he became a plebe was a vow to uphold the Constitution of the United States. So that was the central thing that he was focused on. So imagine when you get to the presidency, not only having been a general where things are organized in a certain way to gain quick results, you suddenly find yourself in the middle of retail politics, and it's a very different thing for a general to come into that situation. So a lot of the tools he used during the war, he brought with him into the presidency, including being surrounded by people of very different viewpoint to what you just said a minute ago. He wanted pushback. He wanted pushback all the time because the worst thing you can do in a military situation is to have a set of default assumptions about what your adversary, your enemy is
Mhm.
going to do, right? So what you need to do is to assure at all times that you're getting as much feedback and as much information as you can to enable an informed decision. And so he brought that into the White House, and many people thought, oh gosh, how did they make that work? Well, he made the final decision. He's president of the United States, but not without a lot of feedback.
Yeah, which is such an amazing lesson. By the way, we opened it up to questions, and folks who are watching, you can also submit your questions as well now, but we also asked ahead of time too, Susan. And one of them came from Robert, who wanted to know, we talked obviously about Korea briefly. We also talked, of course, about what was happening in Little Rock, sending in the troops. And that was, of course, such a pivotal moment, having those African Americans attend the high school there in Little Rock. I mean, it's an extraordinary moments that happened during his presidency. The other thing is, of course, a lot of people were asking about the space wars and Sputnik. And what was interesting, you talk about this in your book, is how he really sort of privately, of course, allowed the Russians to put their satellites up first. And he did that intentionally. And Bob wanted to know, tell us that story and why that was so pivotal.
Well, you know, we take a lot of things about space for granted. And one of the things we take for granted is the fact that countries around the world can launch their own satellites into space and can do so without worrying about being shot down. As we all know about the principle of sovereign airspace, certainly at the dawn of the space age, there was no precedent that established freedom of access to space. There were even debates about whether sovereign airspace extended all the way out into the cosmos, which would then make it impossible for any nation to necessarily, put up a satellite in low Earth orbit. So the story about Sputnik really starts with the International Geophysical Year that was advanced by the International Scientific Union to explore unexplored parts of the world and the cosmos. And they actually got the United States and the Soviet Union to sign on to International Geophysical Year's goals and to commit to launching an artificial satellite in 1957. So Eisenhower decides that he's going to make this a peaceful, obviously under the terms of IGY, it was going to be a peaceful effort. So he had it organized outside of the military proper, and the military was working on a rocket called Jupiter-C. And so to just put a wrap on this story, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in early October, we had already, not only did we know they were going to launch a satellite, the day before or 2 days before the launch, it was on the front page of the New York Times. Okay, but Sputnik went up first, and the Eisenhower administration knew perfectly well that if we had used Jupiter-C, which was part of the Defense Department, that we could have beaten the Soviet Union by a year. But that wasn't the purpose of the exercise. The purpose of the exercise was to explore the cosmos. And by the way, the great added advantage is that if the Soviets went first, they would, probably without not realizing it, internationalize low Earth orbit and above, settling the question of freedom of space forever. The thing is that there was a chance that the Soviet Union, if they didn't go first, would then cry foul the way they did over aerial overflights of the Soviet Union. But you know what? The Eisenhower administration had offered the Soviet Union a chance to overfly our military installations to avoid surprise nuclear attack. So the fact that the Soviet Union went first settled that question and made everything that goes on in space today possible without this becoming another very dangerous flashpoint in the Cold War.
And also Nikita Khrushchev, he obviously, there was such pivotal moments there between your grandfather, then President Eisenhower, and Khrushchev actually came to Washington, right? He invited him for what was it, like 10 days and got to meet his grandkids. You met him.
Oh yeah, well, right. Well, you know, the thing is that the burning issue at that time, now in 1958, is over the future of Berlin, which is which was a contentious point after World War II. And the Soviet Union wanted this four-power agreement to come to an end. And the three powers, the three Western powers, were not ready for it to come to an end and did not like the terms of this. So Khrushchev threatened us and said that we had to have this done by a certain date. And of course, that wasn't going to fly. So they planned a summit in May, or they were still working on getting a date at that point. But it turns out that one of his subordinates misread something and sent an invitation to the Soviet premier to come here for 10 days. Now, this is typical of Eisenhower. I think he thought it was premature, a visit like that, but nevertheless, absolutely backed up his subordinate. And by the way, didn't fire him either. I think that came out of the State Department, that little miscommunication. But Khrushchev came, and Eisenhower thought, we're going to make the best of this situation. So Khrushchev was given a tour of the United States of America, stopping in all sorts of important places like obviously New York and Los Angeles, San Francisco. And then he went to a farm in Iowa. It was a big thing. And then the last day of the meeting was going to be a summit to see what to do about this ultimatum, which could have gone nuclear, by the way, because we did not have a conventional way. So to make a long story short, no agreement was reached. So my grandfather did what he often did, which is to call my mother and ask her to get us all cleaned up and over to the farm. In a half an hour, he says, I'm bringing Khrushchev to the farm, and let's just have a family visit and see if that, helps things.
So you may have played a big role in the, we can thank you for peace in the world.
Well, all I can say is I think what was one of the reasons for peace in the world is that we were so overtrained as kids. You have no idea. The instructions we got about what to do while we were sitting there with the Soviet premier. In any case, Ike understood that the Russians are human beings too, and love children. And Khrushchev went back to Moscow and talked about that visit a lot. And he later dropped a certain date on the ultimatum in Berlin. And slowly over the years, we managed to find a resolution to that. But I think it tells me not only did Ike have a grandchildren strategy, but he also always was trying to find touchstones where two sides could agree on something, to then see if it could be enlarged and expanded.
That is such a pivotal comment. And we just have just about a minute or so left, Susan. I want to wrap it up. Of course, we got a number of our watchers are asking about also the Eisenhower Memorial. Kate is asking particularly, what would your grandfather think about that, which was recently unveiled in Washington, D.C.? And how would he also look back on just his legacy?
Well, it's interesting. I remember him once saying, "Don't let them put me on a horse," because if you live in Gettysburg, all of the great commanders are on horses, and it's not that he ever thought that there would be a memorial, but just of the things we were supposed to be alert not to allow to happen. Well, and that's because he believed that everybody had played their part and everybody had done their duty and done their jobs, and that he was a leader of people, but he wasn't the only person who was marching forward. I mean, so what I love about that memorial? Ike is with people. He is leading people at that memorial. He's not one of the memorials in Washington where it's so completely singular that you would think that this person did everything themselves. I think Ike, being a very humble man, would be overwhelmed by the fact of this memorial and come up with a million reasons why he was undeserving. But I must say that the design we finally came up with, I think, is a great credit to him, and he would be, I'm sure, really quite overwhelmed. And thank you for that question, because it was a very big moment for everybody, and recognition for my family that this is our goodbye. I mean, he now belongs thoroughly to history.
Well, and thank goodness he belongs to all of us. And also, I just want to say, Susan Eisenhower, your grandfather would be so deeply, deeply proud of you. what you have accomplished and how you are carrying on his legacy and the incredible work that you are doing. And this book is just absolutely beautiful. Again, it's called How Ike Led, and I encourage everybody to get it. But you just keep up the wonderful work. It's so fantastic to have you here with us, Susan. Thank you very much.
Well, Rita, let me just close by saying it's been a huge honor for me, and I just can't say enough about the wonderful program you have underway and the importance it's going to play as we all move forward as a nation, hopefully united.
Absolutely. What a wonderful way to end. Susan Eisenhower, thank you, my friend. Wonderful to have you with us. And
Good to
everybody
see you.
watching this, thank you so much for joining us and participating too. Keep your questions. This is so wonderful. Keep them coming. We love hearing from all of you. And also to find out about future speakers that we will have, because we have a lot of them lined up at the Global Service Institute. Make sure you check out our website. It is globalserviceinstitute.org, globalserviceinstitute.org. And we will see you very soon.